All right. So, welcome everybody to Archiving Queer Futures, an online event from Lavender Menace, a queer literature and community archive based in Edinburgh. We are so excited to be joined by Eman Abdelhadi and Nat Raha tonight. So, if you're not obsessed with their work already, you can pick up copies of the books they talk about from Lighthouse Edinburgh's Radical Bookshop. So we are recording this event, but only our speakers' names and cameras are being recorded, so you can just relax if you're watching. Tonight we will have some brief introductions to our speakers, a discussion between Nat and Aman about their work, and then readings from their works. There will be a Q&A at the end, so just put any questions you have for our speakers in the chat and we'll pick them up at the Q&A. So, Dr. Eman Abdelhadi is joining us from Chicago today. She's actually our very first international speaker that we have joining us online from America. She's an activist, academic, and writer who thinks at the intersection of gender, sexuality, religion, and politics. They're an assistant professor and sociologist at the University of Chicago, where they research American Muslim communities. So today she'll be talking about her book, Everything for Everyone, An Oral History of the New York Commune, 2052 to 2072, from 2002, which she co-authored with M.E. O'Brien. Everything for Everyone is a collection of speculative oral histories that narrate the chaos of capitalist nation states in 2050 and looks back at the creation of a communal way of living from multiple voices and perspectives. Dr. Nat Raha is an Edinburgh-based poet and activist scholar. Her research focuses on transfeminism, practices and collectives of care and social reproduction, racial capitalism, and decolonisation across poetry, art, and politics and history. She's the author of 4 books of poetry, including Apparitions, Nines, and Of Sirens, Bodies, and Faultlines. And her critical writing has appeared in Social Texts, the South Atlantic Quarterly, Trans Studies Quarterly, and she also co-edited Imagining Queer Europe Then and Now, a special issue from Third Texts in 2021. So tonight, Nat will be talking about Trans Femme Futures, Abolitionist Ethics for Transfeminist Worlds, a book she co-authored with Mijke van der Drift in 2024. Trans Femme Futures examines the radical possibilities of trans femme collective liberation through a critical exploration of practices of care, complicity, and solidarity. So I will hand over to the two of you. Right. Welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction.
Thanks.
It's great to be here.
Thanks, Kiva. Thanks for having us, Lavender Menace. Thanks for being here, Eman. We were exchanging stories that we met about a year ago, sort of, in Chicago. So it's nice that we're here virtually in Edinburgh.
Yeah.
You're glad you're not here. It's chaos, maybe.
I did hear there's a
defense.
festival going on.
Yeah. We're gonna dive straight in, and maybe we should just give a little heads up of what the structure of today's event is. We decided that I'm going to ask Iman some questions about Everything for Everyone, an oral history of the New York Commune, 2052 to 2072. And then Iman's going to ask me some questions about Trans Femme Futures, and I guess the conversation is going to be expansive as well. And then we're going to do some readings, each of us from each of the books, and then we'll be open for Q&A. And we've got until about 7:30, should we need it. And questions in the chat. That's what we've got to keep remembering. Okay, so I'm going to dive in with these questions because they're all quite long-winded. So as you know, man. So for people who haven't read it, this book is a set of oral histories that are produced over written over a 5-year period in terms of the narrative of the book. And so I wanted to begin with a question on form. People in the chat know I'm a literary geek. And I was wondering if you could speak about the structure of this book as an oral history. I was thinking about the relationship between the oral history work that both you and Michelle O'Brien, the other author, have undertaken kind of elsewhere, and also the writing of oral history as speculative fiction. How did you decide to work in this form? And how did you co-author these histories? Why oral history?
Yeah, thank you for that question and all your thoughtful questions, which I'm excited about. So we both, as you alluded to, have done oral history. So I do oral histories for my sociological work, and Michelle used to ran the Trans Oral History Project, which was in collaboration with the New York Public Library, and is a great archive of interviews with
Yes.
trans New Yorkers.
It's
That
all
folks should
online.
look
It's
up.
all online, isn't it?
Yeah. So we've both done a lot of oral history, and I think, we both believe that oral history is an important method because it sort of it's at the intersection of individual agency and how people manage their own lives and make choices. But also it shows how those choices are constrained by and against the backdrop of geopolitical and structural constraints. So I think we both see oral history as an important format for that. And, I note that oral history is something that many, Black historians and authors have had to fight for as a legitimate method of also writing history itself. So I think it's an important form. And in terms of the book, it really allowed us to cover a really large span of time, right? Because we had characters who were born who are sort of our age, and then we had characters that were born basically in a post-revolutionary future. So it would have been very difficult for a 200-page traditional novel to cover that much ground, that much of a time span. And at the same time, it allowed us to cover a large geographic span because folks, the characters moved between places. So, you could have a character that had lived in China, you had a character who lived in Palestine. And so you could get glimpses of what we were sort of trying to paint as a global revolution. So I think it served like both of these purposes really well for the book. And frankly, it was just a lot easier to write than a traditional novel. Like neither of us is a fiction writer primarily. We've both written more fiction since the novel, and we're working on more now. But it was for both of us, I think, it would have been very intimidating to just like try to write a traditional novel. And so this kind of gave us this felt much more manageable. And, there's this way that people can kind of write into the book. So people have assigned this book at universities, and often the assignment, the final assignment is to write your own fictional oral history. And actually we're now launching a website where people can write into the world of Everything for Everyone. So yeah.
I mean, you say it's easier, but I feel like writing speech in a way that feels real is also a challenge. And I'm thinking about also the kind of, there are like, there's like vocabulary that develops. I think people being referred to as chaps quite a lot. It's quite funny in particular. But also that, yeah, I guess it gives the characters a chance to speak about their experiences of the world in that sense, and their visions of the world that has arrived, and that has been born.
Yeah.
How did you do this practically though, in terms of did you write the interviews that you authored, or did Michelle write the ones, or vice versa, or did you both write them?
The ones that we are like the interviewees for were the primary authors of those. So the way we did it when we proposed the book to Common Notions, we wrote up little like blurbs of each of the potential characters. So we had a kind of outline of the world, sort of what a lot of that ended up in the introduction. And then we had like a paragraph for each character. And yeah, we each proposed like 6 characters, and then we kind of gave each other feedback, and then we just started writing them one by one. And we would rewrite each other's work and edit it, and our editor, Andy Battle, also did a lot of gave us a lot of feedback on these early chapters. But yeah, practically that's like we just kind of wrote them, and then there was then we had to really adjust the timeline. We had a kind of general timeline of this world that we were building that was in the introduction, but then as we wrote these, the timelines really changed, and we needed like some consistency. And so we had to, there was like an iterative process between the interviews and the introduction to just make sure that it all kind of cohered. Yeah.
Nice. I like this because one of the questions I've been getting, or that my current, I mean, maybe not so much in public conversations, but definitely in terms of like the conversations about how do you write a book with another person that I've been getting around Trans Femme Futures is like, yeah, did you write, it's like we really produced this book discursively. There are a lot of conversations that we had that we recorded and then we transcribed. And then there are other times where one person started writing a chapter and the other person wrote a chapter. But by the end of the editing process, you forget who kind of began what. And to try, like, the book's kind of has a multiplicity of voices, but it's also just like, actually, that's kind of what we want. We want to like refuse the individual authorship a little bit and be open to this, to being changed by your co-author as well in the learning process.
I love that.
Cool. Okay, so moving to my next question is thinking about the radical history of New York City, which is also like special interest for me, and its importance as a locus of so many political movements across history. It's really fascinating to see how in your book, New York is both explicitly a site of revolution and also kind of belated in relation to global ecological and cultural developments. So could you speak a little bit about this kind of dual character of New York and like why New York also?
Yeah. Well, we were both, I used to live in New York for a long time. Michelle has lived there for a couple of decades now.
For like 60 decades, I guess, by the time.
Exactly.
Like
yeah. We both have enormous love for the city. I mean, I had just moved away to Chicago, when we were writing this book. And so I think, and in many ways, both of our political development happened in the book. I mean, in the city, in New York. And so there's a sort of like love letter to the city kind of beneath the novel. But I think that it felt really important to me from both like a kind of theoretical perspective of like how I think world revolution will unfold, and from a symbolic perspective that the global north, that like Europe and North America, and particularly the US, are not the leaders of the revolution. So often on the left, we have this like idea that, even on the left, I think we often have this idea that like whatever we do, the rest of the world is going to follow. And the reality is that so much of the revolutionary, what has happened, so much of like the revolutionary uprising that has happened around the world has not happened in the context of the center of empire, and I think on a theoretical level there is this sense that for me, one of the core kind of theses of the book is that the nation state falls because of increasing crisis, and when the nation state falls, the market and the nation state basically fall in tandem, and their falls are like mutually reinforcing, right? It wouldn't make sense for the places with the strongest states to be the first ones to have this fall, right? And the reality is that we have, I mean, in the US, and we feel it now more than ever with Trump, there's an enormous, first, the state is incredibly powerful, its ability to surveil, its ability to police, and the amount of consent that people have for it, like the like willingness to revolt is so low here, right? Like our neighbors are literally getting kidnapped off the street. And some of the things that are happening in the US and even other Western countries, like I can't imagine that there wouldn't be riots in France if like France was going through exactly what we were going through. I mean, and there's already, there are issues there as well, obviously. But so I think that these states are actually going to be the last to fall. I think that where you have the weakest states and like already the crises of climate catastrophe, the crises of, so sort of like falling markets and falling states, that's where the first kind of revolutionary uprisings are going to happen. And we'll have more and more, and it'll eventually spread to these places, but they're not at the forefront.
And I guess there's a sense of like, on the one hand, I think the conversation about the colonial boomerang in Aimé Césaire's kind of formulation has been quite present, at least in the UK recently. I say recently, in like the last 5 to 10 years, where we're really rethinking about re-remembering that Britain is an ongoing form of empire. And next to that, also thinking about some of the key social movements of the last 15 years having always been like, say, the Arab Spring, Tahrir Square, these moments of uprising happened in the Levant, and the the global north or the metropole, however we want to think about it, is belatedly enacting something in the spirit of this, maybe. And often that the histories of, say, of Occupy is like that those connections get disconnected. Sorry, those international links get disconnected, and actually there's a real key work, like an ongoing key work in kind of less leftist historiography to be like, no, actually these are all this, we're all internationally interconnected already, like,
Right.
we're all inspired by each other's modes of resistance, and that's already happening internationally as well.
That's right.
And maybe you could speak a little bit about that in relation to the novel. I'm thinking about the liberation of the Levant. It's also this kind of key historical event that takes place in Everything for Everyone.
Yeah, I think that's exactly as you put it, right? There's this way that we tend to erase these connections, but also, we often will say on the left, like, you can't have revolution in just one state, right? Like, you can't have communism in just one state. You can't have, and I think that increasingly that feels more and more true. And I think we are. It's also a question of like where is the state strongest, like I said, but also where are movements strongest, and where is there fodder for people to rise up, and whether that's like material resources or sort of ideological ones as well. And frankly, like the movements that we've seen across the world, even though they've been horribly crushed, just as they've been crushed here in the US and in Western Europe, have had just like so much radical potential and radical forms that have often made their way over here, and often in kind of diluted versions of themselves. So yeah, I think there's this sort of recognition of this interdependence, which also comes into the sort of political economy of the book, right? How do we communize in a world in which we are so interdependent on each other for production, becomes one of the kind of questions of the book as well.
Great. I'm sorry, I'm making extra notes.
It's okay. Yeah.
It's on the subject of being radically crushed.
Yeah.
So a number of friends, writers, comrades, some of whom I hope are watching, so shout, you know who you are, or watching the recording, watching live or watching the recording, spoke of how the book like rewired their brains, that's the phrasing, on reading it. How do you understand the role of culture, be that literature, the arts, in the revolutionary transformation of the world that we're trying to usher? And maybe rather than thinking about what literature doesn't do, because I think we have a lot of conversations about like literature isn't, it's next to activism or being on strike or a blockade, like literature isn't these things. Sure. We could think about what it does differently to other forms of political organizing, or mutual aid or social justice, education, or even archiving that we're involved in. So like, what does literature do differently?
Yeah, I think, I think often about this. In the spring, Judith Butler came to Chicago, where I teach, and they gave this amazing lecture about how the fascist right has been able to basically excite the passions of the public, mostly through this kind of like sadistic, vengeful fantasy, right? That's both nostalgia for the past and a sort of vision of like total control. And often on the left, we've countered that with sort of like very effectively modest proposals, right? Either like modest proposals or sort of like proposals that are not fleshed out fully. And we'll say like, oh, these people are lying to you. These people are like these kind of really rational like explanations. And part of what Butler was arguing is like, people know that Trump is lying. It's actually part of the appeal. It's that he is able to go out in public and break the rules, and that excites the passions, right? That people are like this, and it's part of people's dissatisfaction with their material reality, and he's giving them a sort of like narrative. And I think that on the left we need to offer radical futures that excite the passions, and we need to do that both as organizers, right? So in terms of being able to say, what is this world that we're fighting for? It's not a nostalgia for like global liberalism, right? It's not a nostalgia for the 90s, right? Or any of these moments that pretend like that liberals have nostalgia for. It's actually about futurity, right? It's not about a return to the past. We often do the same nostalgia, right? It's about offering something completely different. It's saying to people, yes, I agree with you. Life is fucked up and broken. And we can just go and do something completely different. And being able to flesh that out into a world, I think you can uniquely do that in fiction in ways that, and in ways that, again, to use Butler's words, excite the passions. That's something that is really hard to do in a theoretical essay. It's really hard to do in things that are not art, right? And I think should be in conversation, right? Again, Michelle and I, neither of us is a fiction writer primarily, right? But this was a fiction manifestation of like a decade of political conversations about revolution and transition and what it would look like. So I think that this remains a very important form. And I agree with folks who say like, this is not the same, I still organize them in the streets, etc. Like it's not the same, but I think it's in dialogue with, and it helps bolster. And I think if we're really committed to building a completely radically different world, we do need ideological change. We need cultural change. We need to dissipate. And this is what I loved about your book too, right? That it like takes very seriously this, like, how do we treat each other in this future world that we anticipate, and what of that could we already begin to embody? So I think for me, some of the most depressing moments are when our book is taught, and I have like a 19-year-old say to me, but no one's gonna work if you don't. And I'm a hardcore materialist, right? Like I'm a Marxist, I'm a materialist, but at the end of the day, like the ideology, the way that the ideology of this system works, that's part of our battle. Like we have to fight the ideological grounds. We have to fight a world in which people believe that without the state and without the police, everyone's going to just kill each other within minutes. Or that without, the profit motive, that no one's going to produce anything, even though it doesn't take much to realize that that's not true. Like it takes a few minutes of conversation, but the idea is extremely powerful, and it's really shaped the world that we live in.
And it's, on the one hand, it's coming back to revealing how narrow the vision of possibility or of production of like why we work is, how that aperture is really narrowed by capitalism, by the expectations, especially as I feel like maybe this is more pronounced sometimes with younger folks who haven't seen visions of alternatives or other ways of organizing the world.
Exactly.
And because one of the things that for me, when I was thinking about the rewiring of the brain, is actually to also face up to these kind of like these like major historical catastrophes that take place in the book, and having to face them and face what comes after them as well. And maybe I'm going to jump to what's the fifth question on the thing, if that's cool.
Yeah, sure.
Wait, when I get there, what was I going to say? I was going to say, yeah, that I'm thinking about maybe this question around, I'm like, you're like, me and Michelle are not fiction writers, but you are oral historians. So there's some question around like the speculative history that you are still working in a form that you know really intimately, that you've spent so much time with, literally. And okay, so question 5. So the book's published in 2022. And one of the challenging things about reading it now, during the agonizingly ongoing genocide in Gaza, it's day 672 of the genocide, is to read in the book visions and echoes of dystopian events that have since taken place in Gaza. I'm thinking especially of, in the book, I'm trying to remember if it was the NYPD, this bombing of Elmhurst Hospital in Queens in 2050. after it had been liberated by patients and the commune after the failure of the hospital to provide care during year 3 of a global pandemic. Alongside today's total, if not partial, destruction of most of Gaza's medical facilities, or their debilitation through the total blockade of supplies, there's also these historical resonances of radical anti-imperial and anti-colonial activism. I was thinking about the Young Lords, who famously took over Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx in New York in 1970 to reorient its services towards Latinx people who were experiencing life-affecting racialized medical neglect. It's a great documentary on that, by the way, if people want to watch it on YouTube, called Takeover. Could you speak about facing the extremities of such horror, like creatively on the page, and the importance of envisioning possibilities, both in terms of the challenges radical action faces, and what it may manifest?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question because, I've gotten some feedback, people are like, well, you wrote so much destruction into the world, right? Like Iranians, being like, this was so traumatic to read.
FYI, if you haven't read the book, America Goes to War in Iran, and that basically facilitates the collapse of America as well.
Yeah. And I think to that, my response is that we're already here. The collapse is here. The apocalypse is here. Pakistan was underwater-ish, under a third of Pakistan was underwater. I mean, just yesterday, like hundreds of people died from these new cloud bursts that, so to me, it's the only way that the book was going to do what it was intended to do was if it took collapse seriously, right? Like otherwise we end up with these transition narratives that are effectively liberal and that are effectively like somehow the state turns into a benign actor, right? Or like somehow we like take over. And listen, I'm someone who is like, we should fight on every front that we have given where we are. So I'm not mad at the people who are like running for elections on far left candidates. Like, fine, whatever, do what you need to do. Yeah, when anyone's running far right, I am mad at, absolutely. Yeah. But like, I think for me that I think what we are facing right now is this moment in which many people believe the future is impossible. And including many of our people. I have friends who say, like leftist friends who used to be organizers and who are artists and who basically are like, well, we're going extinct and it's my job to help like doula humanity through our extinction. And I find that deeply reactionary. I completely disagree, right? Like I insist on a future. And I think that insistence has to take into account the horror of this moment and has to imagine that we can move through that horror. And I wrote this not having even imagined what happened in Gaza. Like I wrote this book with Michelle, and it's like, and I still, when the genocide started, kept thinking that it was going to be like other bombing campaigns of Gaza and that it was going to end, right? And like for many of us, for months, it was like I lived on my phone waiting for that ceasefire announcement, even though I was organizing 24/7 and like, and none of us could have imagined what Israel would get away with. And even now, with the consensus turning against them, even among centrists, right? There are no consequences. Like they are bombing the fuck out of Gaza City and like they are not facing any consequences. That is the world that we live in. And it's not going to just be Israel, right? Like we're facing martial law in the US, right? So I think for me, we have to face the horror. Like there can't be, if we are going to be serious about building another world, we have to both imagine the worst case scenario and imagine that we can get out of it. And fight it, like fight it tooth and nail, fight for every morsel of food, fight for every single person, that we can fight for. So it's not a matter of resignation. So we wanted the book to be one that took very seriously the horror of the moment that we're in, the catastrophe that capitalism has placed us in, and still believed in fighting and still believed in winning. And you can't have that if you're going to avoid the horrors, right? Like you can't write that book. So I don't know if I even answered your question.
No, it's a
but
beautiful
those
question.
are the thoughts
Beautiful
that
answer. Because in facing the horror and facing the extremities of utopia and dystopia together rather than kind of thinking about them apart, it does also reveal about how we can respond to these moments, how we have responded to these moments, and thinking about the cyclical nature of history rather than a linear one, right?
That's right.
And for me, that's why, this is thinking about historical materialism or queer Marxism, whatever, but like part of the project of going back and exploring queer and trans histories for me, or histories as I usually call them, is to try and witness things that have taken place and to understand how events might happen again, and responses or ways of being together in the world might emerge again, or be reactivated, but they're never going to be reactivated if they're historically obscured or erased or deleted,
Right.
And so the book so clearly elaborates how different communes and revolutionary moments came through the collapse and remaking of social structures, and especially so in the case of the family. Family abolition, of course, is a subject Michelle's written another book on. Family abolition provides multiple horizons and visions of demolishing an insufficiently resourced institution at a moment of social, political, and ecological collapse, alongside the reinvention of child rearing and gestation. Alongside this in the book is a reworking of what caring for other humans looks like or means, from sex work becoming one element of skin work, to people trying to survive various forms of detention camps. Gender and transition are also socially and technologically developed in the book. And many of the interviewees are trans. I was like, is everyone in the book trans? Is that what's happening? Could you speak a little bit about these visions of care, maybe for those who haven't read the book yet, and their emergence in different forms of crises? And like, it really felt like transness and queerness kind of lead the way, but I'm not sure it's just that, but yeah.
Yeah, they certainly do lead the way, I would say. And I think that there's this way that, like in capitalism, right, care is so devalued and so marginalized, and in part because it's feminized. But there's a sort of like mutual constitution there. It's feminized, it's devalued because it's feminized, and it's feminized because it's devalued. Yeah. And in a way, I mean, one reviewer described the book as like an economy of care, that like effectively care becomes the primary motive of all kind of social relations. And so, the book, the New York version of the revolution starts with a food riot, and that was very much on purpose, right? The idea that like we are going to first start with taking care of our most basic social reproductive needs, so that social reproduction, the act of reproducing ourselves as human beings, right? Food, sex, child rearing, all of this becomes central to how we organize our society, right? That it's central to the commune, not secondary to it, not there to just bolster production for profit, which is how we live under capitalism. So I think that like the queerness and the feminist, right, are both like central to that. It's a complete kind of reordering of the world. And it's, for me, a much more rational one, right? It's one that makes, like, if we made decisions as a society based on how to care for the collective and for the individual, like we would make much more efficient decisions. We would make decisions that prioritize our collective survival, our planet's collective survival, our continuity. And so the book sort of imagines that once you remove the profit motive, right? Once you remove capitalist social relations, that becomes the primary mode by which both individual and collective decisions are made. So it's really at the heart of the book, and the sort of destruction of the nuclear family, or the replacement of the nuclear family, becomes a huge part of that, right? That we imagine a world that where who you're related to, who you're married to, who, I don't know that people get married, but who you have long-term romantic or otherwise relationships with, who you want to live with, that none of that matters for what you have access to eat, your clothing, your housing, like all of those things are met. All of those needs are met by the collective, are met by the commune. And that opens up all the space for how people can relate to each other. So instead of going, I always think about these like anti-Soviet, like, we used to have to watch this in high school, they would like make us watch these documentaries about the Soviet Union and like how, and everything was like gray and everyone lived in the same apartment and like led these like cookie cutter lives. And like, whatever, all the critiques of the Soviet, like, obviously had nothing to do with that. The actual Soviet Union was all about like filling our heads with like, capitalist propaganda. But what's interesting is like we lead such cookie cutter lives under capitalism, and as a queer person who is constantly like trying to do something a little different, right, like you butt up against the material constraints, right, the push towards coupledom, the push towards monogamy, the push towards compulsive heterosexuality, all of these things. And so what we kind of try to explore in the book is the way that everything opens up and you really do have a diversity of like kinship forms as people are no longer making these decisions based on material interests. They're making them based on affinities, dispositions, availability, etc. So,
and not just about kinship and care, right? Because I think one of the later chapters, you're also thinking about the like question of abuse and harm of interpersonal interpersonal violence within the family, or within a not a family, but within a care unit of between parent and child. And your character speaks through like what happens to their parent who's kind of who's there's a huge conversation. Everyone who's involved in their lives has a big conversation about it. There's already this kind of structure of support for that person, and the child has multiple other parents to also kind of look out for them, having experienced this harm as a minor. And even that is also in this, like, there are other ways. I think, because this is the question we always get asked as abolitionists, right? Like, what are you going to do with the abusers? And it's say actually the structures that we are within now also don't have the means or the ability to function to really create some kind of system of transformative justice, or not even system, just like a way to do transformative justice, purely because we don't have enough people around to do the care labor that actually entails. Which I think is kind of a really interesting vision as well, to link this question to say transformative justice is actually is a practice of care, both in terms of accountability of somebody who's committed an act of violence, and also supporting a survivor.
That's right.
Yeah.
And as you know, it's a practice of care that takes time and energy, and it's often against that constraint that we find ourselves, like when we have these conflicts, even conflicts that are not as I have a conflict with a close friend, and we've been trying to schedule a processing conversation for like 2.5 weeks, right? And it's like, we can't seem to like sit down and be like, here are my thoughts and feelings, right? And it becomes even harder when there's abuse on the table or anything else.
Yeah. Okay, we're at 6:45, because we are talking. Should I ask this last question, or do you want to flip?
Maybe let's flip. I would love, I want to make sure people get a chance to, I'm excited to ask you my questions. So I love the book. I'm holding up the book in case people haven't gotten it yet. It is so beautiful, and just really, I think, innovative in the way that you talk about how we relate to each other. And I think there's so much, you really embody the ethics that you're advocating for, because I feel like there's so much gentle critique in the book of what we've been doing so far that really hasn't worked for us in movement spaces. So I want to start with this. The book is Abolitionist Ethics for Transfeminist Worlds. And I wanted to ask you, all my questions are really just chances to kind of share the concepts of the book, because I think they're really rich. So I wanted to ask you first to talk about ethics? Why focus on ethics? How do you define ethics? And why should we attune to them in this particular moment, as we're facing these like horrific crises and some of the hardest organizing challenges I think many of us have ever faced?
Thanks for that question. Part of it is because we feel like ethics is a term, like I say we as me and myself and Mijke, they would give very different answers also. So get my answers. Thinking about ethics as an alternative frame to doing politics, and in thinking about ethics, it's to really try and center like how we live our lives, what we are doing in our lives, what we have power and agency over. Kind of agency is really the key term here. Partly because we'd obviously, like both of us are writing out of social movements. I've primarily been involved in queer and trans organizing and some anti-racist, anti-imperial organizing too over the last 15 years in different forms. Sometimes more explicitly political formations, being like, we're making demands of a state or whatever to end austerity, fund trans healthcare. Sometimes in more collective forms. And ethics is to say, actually, like what we do kind of matters more than the demands we're trying to make of the state, or at least in terms of where we center our activities and our actions and our reflections. That's not to say like people shouldn't be making demands of the state. I think we were just frustrated about being in the grammar, of the political grammar of like, oh, I have politics, I'm going to make a demand of the liberal, neoliberal nation state to give me something that they probably don't want to give me. And maybe there are some times where those concessions are more easily winnable than at others. And in that sense, it's also in the spirit of what abolition is about, which is to really think about how we live our lives, what we're doing with our lives, the forms of behavior we show for each other, how we organize together, how we make how we are in worlds and lives with each other already. And that it's to say like we can do this now. It's maybe prefigurative politics is a way to be thinking about it, but to really be like, we're not going to wait until the state turn around and give us what we want before we try and create the revolutionary world that we want to exist in. So it's kind of like why ethics. I think also make us a kind of like maybe a dethroned Aristotelian is maybe she's like, we got to throw out quite a lot of Aristotle, but like there's some bits here from like for Nicomachean ethics in particular, where she's like, oh no, like ethics is a useful way to think about it because politics is still about our relationship with the polis, and which in a Scottish context, we're thinking about the city-state, not the polis, which is what Scottish people call the police. But that, that in that doubling, everything is there already, that the polis is already this kind of exclusive city-state world that privileges is already written through the kinds of privileges and hierarchies that we also do want to destroy, or dismantle. So it's a sense of like, and I feel like I had a dozen conversations with different people saying like, what do you do if you abandon politics? People don't want to abandon politics. Politics is how we understand our politics, and we're trying to not say you have to abandon politics, but we're trying to say there are other ways to think about it, which maybe offer something else that thinking about politics in this form of critique doesn't let us do. So
yeah, I think there's a critique of critique, right, it's
critique of critique
in the book that I find extremely helpful, because I think, and especially as an academic, right, like so much of academic intervention into like social movements has just been critique and deconstruction, right? And offering very little in response, but also just in this kind of like, well, everything you do is stuck in the system anyway, so you're stuck, and like silly you for, and I've seen that destroy social movement spaces.
And I think because we get trained into doing that, into making arguments, like I think it's quite interesting going back into the 70s and you see these complaints where people just want to write about how they think things should be, and no one actually wants to do the work. And then meanwhile, if I'm trained through the humanities, kind of really did my my training in queer studies, and critique is what we learn to do. We learn to critique things. And meanwhile, we're always like, oh, but how do these things relate to our everyday lives? So if you start at that point being like, how do these things relate to our everyday lives? That doesn't necessitate critique, although critique is obviously kind of important as part of that too. Yeah.
So speaking of which, the book has implicitly, it sort of questions the emphasis on positionality and privilege and identity categories as ways to structure, especially like social movement spaces and trans and femme spaces. So I'm curious if you could talk more about that, and sort of in a related term, talk about how you see trans and femme, right? The way I understood you, the way I understood the book, you were saying these aren't just stable identities, but they're modalities and frameworks. Can you share more about that for folks who haven't read the book and yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah. It's been interesting because we're trying to not be like we're against identity politics, but we're trying to be like, actually, we think of identity in terms of its historical importance, which we're for the Marxists in the room. It's like, oh yeah, no, we come from somewhere and we have these lineages and these trajectories that have brought us to where we are now. And meanwhile, I think we really wanted to focus about practices. So again, to come back to this, like, oh, it's really about what we're doing, or how we're trying to work through what we're doing, how we're trying to reflect on what we're doing. Which is to say, we're thinking a lot about both, maybe all the words in Trans Femme Futures being verbs, but maybe trans and futures being the two key verbs in that as well. Trans as a verb promote, like, prioritizing kind of these questions of practices, this sense of, we always keep coming back to Susan Stryker talking about this refusal of an unchosen starting point to moving towards somewhere else. And the moving doesn't have to be spatial or whatever, but it's to say there's this crux of like refusal, and then of also being like, oh, it's really about trying to do something, and that doesn't have to be doing something that succeeds. That can also be trying to do something that is also failing. Which is then to say, like, oh, there are a series of trans practices that basically anyone can do, and you don't have to be trans to do them. Or if you do them, you're trans, like, congratulations, you're trans now. And that sounds quite abstract when I say it that way, but we're really trying to think about, obviously, we're already talking about this conversation around care. Some of this is really embedded in both like practical everyday forms of care, but also in kind of the infrastructures that we collectively produce, that we kind of have this proposal that like transing happens in relation through other people, that we really kind of all enable each other to exist. That it's a collective production that's also to try and flip the degrees of power of medicalization through which transness has often historically been and continues to often be framed, right? And femme maybe is like more useful to think about as a modality, and I'm like, maybe we can get to the future. Get back to the future. But for us, femme was really I think on the one hand, we think about its kind of aesthetics and the kinds of relations to the world, or to the various worlds, but to like the environment. Like, there's multiple ways we can think about that, ecologies, but also social ecologies, that feminist is kind of about. And meanwhile, to be like, actually, there's something, again, like in the midst of like this contradiction of like care being feminized and the feminization of care and the negativity around that and the denigration of that, is to say, actually, there are a series of practices that come through feminist, femininity, and care, maybe, that actually are really important visions of how the world could be, which could involve, like, say, being open in a way that involves engaging with multiple people to try and figure out how we feel together. Like, it could be like, okay, so the patriarchal approach is like this top-down, like, I say it is so, which is to quote Mijke, an exercise that Mijke does, and say like, and then the women are left, in this patriarchal structure to do all the work of like, oh, so yeah, I know it sucks. Like, I'm sorry, this is how it goes. Like, what do you think of this? Oh yeah, doing all of that emotional labor in this kind of repressive form, and say, actually, that moment of those interactions, not necessarily the drainingness of the emotional labor, But like that moment of emotional connection is what we want to maintain and is part of how we envision social change happening. And that's kind of, it's not just a organizing strategy, but that is also like just an everyday strategy, right? That is about these questions around openness, it's about engagement, it's about nourishing how we relate to each other, being reflective about that. And yeah, and I think meanwhile, like we're really thinking about feminists as also in its kind of like we live through these forms of femininity that are kind of dispossessed in certain ways, that are abject, but they're also spaces in which we find their spaces, sorry, they're forms of expression through which we find joy, through which we find pleasure, through which we find love. And we kind of don't want to throw that away because we felt so much in the queer worlds that we've been in the last 15 years or so. Um, really have denigrated these things, and especially when it's attached to transness, you know. And so we really didn't want to give that away either. And that's not to say like feminist is better than butchness, but it is to say like there's something in feminist that is different from how we think that is, I don't want to say it's just missing in maskedness. But also in being like, we're at this point in queer culture where we can think about these things independently of each other. We don't have to think about butch femme or masc and femininity and masculinity in relation to each other. They're kind of off doing their own things, and that's really exciting and powerful. So yeah, that's yeah.
There seems to be this fear, like in queer communities, I feel like that if you expand the definitions of certain things, right? If you're like, oh, transness is a way to, is a verb, then the spaces that are built, by and for trans people are going to be run over, right? By like people whose experiences of the material world are not constrained by being trans, right? Like that maybe they're not facing a struggle for healthcare, they're not facing day-to-day violence, they're not, facing the same like legislative assaults. I'm just, and it feels like you're writing from a place that's more confident, right? Like that's sort of a little bit seems not as concerned with this question. Like, did that question, I'm sorry, this wasn't in my question,
No,
but I'm
okay.
just responding.
No, of course.
Did that come up for you as like a problem, or what would your response be to that concern?
I guess part of it is like, we don't want to do that policing because the state is already doing that policing for us.
Right.
And in relation to, thinking about the legislative restrictions that are in the works here or that are being installed elsewhere, like or in various parts of the world, but like, through, I just call it the ruling, like this thing that happened with the Supreme Court earlier this year, it's just being ruled over. It's been going on for hundreds of years. They decided to come back for the trans people in this country. But like part of how I responded to that is like, oh, there's various protected characteristics that you can acquire, right? They included like being disabled, and being trans in how it's encoded in the law is one of them. And so it's like, like I don't want to be flippant in this like stop being cis, but to be like, actually no, you can be with trans people in various ways, and part of that is what that refusal could actually mean practically. And so, because this is also part of the thing that we wanted to shift, and maybe this is to kind of second guess the next question a little bit, but to say like, we really also wanted to pull apart these divisions, including of cis and trans, or trans and cis, and say like, because I think queerness's power has been through its openness towards multiplicity and change. And I think in that then face the contradiction of like, so what does it mean when there are people who've like lost everything for their queerness, and then there are people who've lost nothing? And how do we exist in relation to each other? But that's interesting, is actually about how we exist in relation to each other, and how we build a community that it holds all these build a community. How we exist in I don't like the word community, but how do we exist in a social relation to each other that understands all of these heterogeneities and differences? Because that's really the work that we all have to figure out how to do at this point in time, right? And not just queer and trans people. And yeah, and so I think there's something in that of being like, okay, we want to unpack these problems because actually we're way more interested in being in relation to you rather than being divided and separated and othered, saying, oh, these things are for cis people, these things are trans people. which obviously is the struggle of what's happening in terms of this encoding, you know. I think in terms of, I've lost the trail a little bit of what you were asking.
No.
But what we were really seeing is like one of the things that we talk about in the book in the third chapter, especially, which is kind of the chapter about liberalism and politics and the law and bureaucracy and stuff, is about the infrastructure of policing gender in the way that the state seems to want to maintain or policing sex, I should say, is already kind of in there in the architecture of what is called the hostile environment here, which is how the UK has been policing migrants and refugees, right? To quote Theresa May, who was Prime Minister, but was in charge of was Home Secretary at the time, like 10 years ago, she was like, we want to make Britain a hostile country for migrants and refugees, hostile environment. And so in that infrastructure is all of like this stuff's already like legislative on the books. And I was always like, you know, this is like a wet dream for Trump. You see it as soon as he gets elected, that Theresa May's there hanging out with him on the first week, you know, in his first 10 days in office. And these infrastructures are also partly what we're trying to challenge. That's to say they are legal infrastructures. It means that it's about document checks, it's about passport checks in a way that is now so insidious in our everyday lives that we take it it's off, like you can take it for granted or you can ignore it if you're privileged. But it's simultaneously all these things that we're trying to unpick. So, okay, so if people are literally trying to run by documents, firstly, how do we not do that? How do we make sure our communities are not based on those terms? And secondly, what do we do to actually make sure our social worlds are not constituted through these divisions? Because that's also what we see, especially in queer, like LGBT communities, about like questions around racism. And it's like, no, like if whiteness is already constitutive of your space, like you've already kind of done something wrong. And there's a whole series of practices and ways of inviting people into the space that might help shift that. But you might actually end up with the second set of contestations, which is the problem of inclusion, which is like people of color get included. It turns out the people who've invited us didn't want us here in the first place, or they feel awkward about it, and they're not able to do the self-reflexive work of feeling through those emotions, of undoing all of that. And because that's hard work, and it's way easier to be like, hey, yeah, let's get in league with a liar who makes us feel good, you know. To go back to what you were saying, not to say that everyone who's racist is a fascist, but hey,
sure.
And I think that's really these questions for us being like, okay, so how do we understand that separability or these forms of social division is like a really key dynamic of the contemporary social world that we're in, the contemporary this like legal political bureaucracy that we're facing in our everyday lives. It's making our lives less livable. And you know, and that's that level of like housing, healthcare, education, work, but also to say like there's so much to also turn the reflection back to ourselves and be like, okay, so how are we actually complicit and implicated in these forms of social division? And like complicity is a key tool that I can talk about more, but like maybe to focus on separability in this moment and just be like, actually no, like there are ways of unmaking these worlds and ensuring these divisions are like that we really embrace the possibilities of multiplicities in our worlds, that we really want to focus on. And that includes like rethinking about what solidarity also is as well, because I think sometimes even the forms of solidarity that we practice also reproduce those things, which sounds counterintuitive, but is maybe also real. So
I want to come back to the solidarity question. I wanted to say, you know, it's interesting because I think a lot of the dynamics that you're describing also come from like that. So much of the way that some of our communities are structured flows from the kind of material structure of like the human rights, the like rights-based model, the nonprofit infrastructure that's been set up where you're competing over small amounts of resources, and they're often sectioned off based on these like identity labels. And we've often reproduced that even in spaces that are not primarily driven, you know, by the nonprofit model. And even though I think, you know, the current attack on NGOs and all this, like, is horribly destructive in some ways. I'm also curious to see what will emerge from a world in which, like, there's no nonprofit funding. Like,
Yeah, right.
whether we are, like, you know, on the one hand, I'm like, it's like, okay, I think a lot of people have done a lot of good within that structure, have used it to the best of their ability, even though they've been critical of it. And it's also been counterinsurgent, like, in many ways, right? And so it's going to be interesting, at least in the US, where that system is falling apart.
I keep coming back to something that I learned / heard during the kind of like during BLM in 2014 here, which was there. I remember kind of asking this question to Amrit Wilson, who's a really important South Asian feminist writer who's been active since the 70s, writer and organizer, about like, what do you do when they cut all the funding to the NGOs? And she was just like, oh, you know, in the 70s, we didn't have any money, but we had to do all this work anyway, because that was just our lives, right? We were experiencing domestic abuse. Nobody was listening to us, or the state provided very limited resources to support, especially like Black and brown women who were experiencing domestic abuse and whose status was also tied to being married, you know, like legal status to be in the UK, say, was being tied to marriage. But simultaneously, also the people who were doing that work were also, who maybe worked for the state, were also like South Asian or Black, right? And yeah, and that these forms of care that we need those needs will always be present until they can be met. And that will exist with or without an NGO industrial complex. And how we organize around that is key. And I think for me, COVID-19 was such a key moment of that, because it was also like, oh, you know, firstly, we felt like we kind of knew what to do because we've been doing mutual aid around trans healthcare for many years before that. But also that, yeah, it showed that we as queer and trans folks have these kind of skills because we're already thinking about, oh, there are these needs. We can try and meet them together by organizing in this way. And that's not to say it's all like roses and dandy, but it was still like, there was a sense of what we can do in response, which I think in the face of either despair or powerlessness, when the state makes you feel powerless, and the despair is the political situation or the crisis that you're facing together, that there are these ways of being together and of doing things. And that's, I think, like, it's really, I mean, part of the joy of being looking about your book, being like, that's what births the commune form. I mean, not to say that revolutionary violence isn't also key to the collapse of state power or the police. But it is to say, yeah, these moments, these practices do really matter, and they do show the way of how we can possibly live. And I really feel that now with around trans healthcare here, being like, oh, you know, people are just doing it in a way that shows the clinic is almost defunct, or it's there for very limited. It doesn't offer what it's supposed to, and people aren't waiting around for that for those breadcrumbs.
Yeah, which is what queer people have always done, right? Like, is to provide, like, to care for each other outside of these structures. I want to end, like, last question on this question of solidarity, right?
So it's 7:10.
Okay. Should we
read? But I'm going to read the bit on solidarity. Yeah. So I'm going
to you go for it then. Go ahead.
But no, but why don't you read first?
Oh, me. Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to read I forgot that we were reading. I think that's why I was like, but I'm going to read, I'm going to share my screen so that folks can follow along if they would like. I feel like this is not showing you anything except.
Oh, we've got like a bar of your pointer.
That's
and
not helpful. Like, I don't know.
On my screen, it's like a little green share button just down at the bottom in the very, very middle.
Yeah.
But it's not doing it.
Oh, here. I found it. I found the right. So now you can see this, right?
Cool.
Yeah. So this is from the second chapter of the book, that I am interviewing Kaukab Hassan and asking about the events of the final Intifada. And I ask them tell me about the day the border fell. And they say, it was the most beautiful day of my life. There had been marches, so many marches. There was the sense that as a movement, we had tried guerrilla warfare on its own, and it hadn't worked. So there had to be both a military presence and just mass uprising. People in Kataib would work on bombing the borders, blowing up military outposts and all that. But most people were just organizers, and they'd work on the marches. The marches were like big fucking parties. It's where everyone let out steam from the stress of the random bombings, the stress of the raids, all of it. We cried and we sang and we danced. The decolonisation were bigger than you'd ever seen. There was a big march that day. It was supposed to be the biggest one, but people were worried that everyone was getting tired of being out and about all the time. We worried no one would show up. But then the Israelis, they attacked a school bus that morning. They straight up shot up this bus, killed all the kids on their way to school. This photo went up on ours of the bus in tatters, bits of flesh everywhere. It was horrifying, and everyone came the fuck out. Like seriously, all of Gaza marched that day. At least 1 million people marched to the border. We stood there and the army started shooting at us, and we started shouting, more will come, more will come, more will come, because it was true. More would come. It was literally do or die. The soldiers were overwhelmed and backing up. They had no real strategy. Ours was to do what we had always done as Palestinians: refuse to stop existing, refuse to disappear. Those of us that were armed started shooting at them. Some people made Molotov cocktails. And of course they shot at us. But when our shuhada would fall, more would come. They couldn't stop us. They started to see that. This woman got on the mic, a comrade, I forget her name. She was killed a few days later. She grabbed this megaphone and started shouting in English, drop the gun and run. It became a chant and everyone picked it up. Hundreds of thousands chanting at these soldiers, drop the gun and run. And eventually they did. They dropped their guns and they ran. And to tell you the truth, we didn't run after them because it wasn't about them. It was about us, how big and beautiful we were in that moment, how unstoppable. We knew that we had done what our parents and grandparents had dreamt of doing. We knew that nothing would ever be the same again. They were what Darwish had called them, abirun, passers-by. Us, Palestine, that was forever. I will stop there. Thanks, y'all. And I'll pass it on. Nat?
It's really devastating. Cool. Right. Right page here. Okay, sure. Can you see my screen? Yeah. Why do we emphasize agency when we think about solidarity? Is solidarity not reaching out to people in situations which you might not be able to do something about? And in times of crisis, allowing people to reach in? Robin Kelly, in a brilliant talk given at the LSE in London, made the argument that solidarity is working for total liberation. This means in part that one works based on where one finds oneself, in connection to one's surroundings, to the surroundings one is in. Solidarity entails enabling one's actions and those of others, creating a context to build power, presence, and possibility. It also means that one questions what tools, methods, or forms one uses to approach organizing and who these tools benefit. For whom do they keep worlds open, and for whom do they close them? Complicity asks questions about entanglement and brings to one's attention resistance and action against forms of organization. Sometimes this means protesting content or the absence of it, and sometimes it means disrupting forms of organization, which can take many direct and indirect forms in itself. Reminding ourselves of Perry Zern and Arjun Shankar, who present curiosity as counterpoint to indifference and imposition, we find forms of solidarity that rest on difference without separability. In the face of objectification and marginalization within the dynamics and effective economies of separability, Solidarity creates vibrations that allow one to break out of patterns of thought and feeling, which may otherwise keep one stuck in commitments that benefit the status quo. Breaking indifference by means of openness allows one to be touched by situations of immiseration, injustice, and hierarchy. It entails cultivating and being animated by a sense of empathy in the unbearable light of injustice. It may entail an active practice, in Saidiya Hartman's words, of loving what is not loved. Through these senses of feeling, which are hopefully grounding and need not to be exiled towards hopelessness, to establish or undertake concrete actions. Not all actions that comprise solidarity are directly relational, but they are informed by a sense of connection. For instance, some forms of redistribution of material resources are not immediate, and the unlearning of assumptions requires self-study. However, solidarity as activity toward total liberation needs collective action and thus needs greater relationalities. Oh, sorry, I haven't gone down. Apologies. I'm not very good at this. This is why I don't read off the screen. We hold that these should not be hierarchical, to allow space for different focus points and different strategies, and not subsuming different struggles under a single form of action. A focus on agency and solidarity takes the pressure off a focus on knowledge, i.e. subjectivity, which in turn enables holding various perspectives at the same time. Shifting the primacy in social change from knowledge to action alleviates the need to have a single coherent vision of what liberation and oppression look like. This might lead to a collective of intimacies, to use Jennifer Nash's term, where different approaches that address separability can come together as active solidarity. Such active solidarities can take the form of delightfully autodidactic approaches that freely draw from different sources and are not subject to disciplinary constraints, an improvisation that keeps patriarchy on the back foot. A solidarity freed from disciplinary registers can cooperate across imposed boundaries, and it remains solidarity as long as it aims at total liberation. Thanks.
Thank you both. Sorry. Thank you both so much for that absolutely fascinating conversation. That was an absolute joy to listen to. Right. I know that we have quite a lot of people here today, so let's open it up for the last sort of 10 minutes. Does anyone have any questions? You can access the Q&A or the chat. Just pop them in there and then we will read them out. In the kind of awkward silence when people construct their question and put it together and get up the courage to type it out. Let me keep half an eye on that. And could I maybe, Cheeky, ask a question? So yeah, I was really curious for both of your work. What kind of evidence, what kind of records, objects, traces do you hope that current and future activists will archive or preserve? I guess for Eman, I'm thinking about that tantalizing little mention of this like public archive in New York that your oral histories are going into. And for Nat, I'm kind of thinking more generally about the work that you're doing now and the sort of traces, objects, records that you'd like to see kept.
Yeah, I mean, so much of what we do in movement feels so ephemeral, like it just kind of appears and disappears. And I worry about this question of archiving all the time, especially as we've moved to like digital forms that I think are harder for future historians to hold. And I actually think that's why oral histories are actually going to be even more important going into the future. But you know, I think about these like snippets of like videos and photos that people take at all of these events, and you know, I don't know where they go after, but I hope that they sort of emerge into the future as like records of all the things that we were able to put together despite of and against the state. So yeah, I think about that a lot, as I've done some archival research. It's not my main method, but when I've like gone into the archives, I'm like, oh, what are our archives going to look like, given that we have so little in the material form? Yeah, it's a good question. I have more like, it's me more saying I don't know and I'm worried, is more my answer than a real answer. Nat, what do you think?
I should have like a preservationist argument, but maybe I'm thinking a lot about, I spend loads of time like looking at old newspapers from the 70s.
Yeah.
But all the little things, badges, banners, bigger things, banners. I think that we make things that we don't think are gonna have relevance and the like for people ahead of us, but then maybe oral histories, historiography, whatever, us doing archival research, like we're actually making the relevance. That's literally what the work that we do,
Yeah.
making things relevant in a time that was unforeseen. And yeah, so I'm just like, I was like, I'm between this mix of like, on the one hand, thinking about the kind of importance of security and the work that we're doing, and that we need to be able to let go of things. You don't have to save every single conversation or group chat or whatever. But please, everyone switch to Signal already if you haven't done so. But next to that being like, actually, it is really important that people who are doing groups, if you've got some material physical traces that you want to preserve, find a way to preserve them. I think a lot about the various kinds of feminist and queer archives we've got here in Scotland, right? And I'm working on some stuff at the moment from kind of like the what's the way to describe it? Socialist feminist organizing in the early 70s in the UK and its interrelationship with gay liberation. And I'm trying to write about a particular branch of the Gay Liberation Front who I have no idea if they have an archive. Like I can't figure it out because they're from a random town in the northwest of England and not from London. And as a result, they have a really different narrative, such as there was no like lesbian gay split in their GLF. And obviously there were trans people involved too, compared to what happened in London, where there was this big blow up around, the lesbians left and the trans people got thrown under the bus, Hey, 1972. And yeah, so I don't know. I'm always just like, please keep things. I can't really talk because I think about all the groups I have. I'm like, who's got the Smash the GIC banner we painted in 2017? Has anyone got that? Does anyone know where it is? I don't know. So,
Cannot believe there aren't any questions. I think everyone's still like thinking and mulling over and absorbing everything that you've been
everyone's
saying.
making dinner. That's good.
Like at the same time
We
as
answered
mulling
them
and
all.
absorbing, you answered all of them.
I've got a question otherwise for
Yeah.
Iman. Can I ask?
Oh, yeah.
Which is on this thing about the relationship between, I was wondering if you could speak about the relationship between queer and trans embodiment and memory. And maybe this is about memory or memory politics. Do you see your book as a work of queer memory beyond the narrative movements, sorry, a work of queer memory beyond the narrative moments where this is implicit? I think about if social, political, and ecological structures of the commune are inaugurated through queer and trans practices, how will this affect or even center the practices of memory that cultures of queer and transness hold sacred?
Wait, say the last part again.
If the social, political, and ecological structures of the commune are inaugurated through queer and trans practices, say queer and trans people leading the way, how will this affect or even center the practices of memory that queer and transness hold sacred? Maybe I was thinking a little bit about how oral histories allow for another narratives to come forward that, say, official histories, even of movement histories, can efface. I see this a lot with gender and
Yeah, I love this question, and I've never gotten this question before. I'm obsessed with memory. I think about memory all the time. I mean, it's very Palestinian of me to be obsessed with memory. It's like kind of our biggest obsession, besides, staying alive. But there's this, I do think the book is a book of queer and trans memory, and in a way, you know, I don't know what's going to happen in the future. You know, I think, you know, I have some ideas, obviously. um, but I think being able to look back and see how queer and trans people saw themselves as part of the transition, right? Like it's such a queer book, it's such a trans book. And this kind of like the centrality of queer and trans modalities and practices as like key to a revolutionary transition that's not liberal, that's not about like rights-based frameworks, that like really rejects like the version of queer and trans advancement that has been handed to us by the last like 30 years, especially. Um, and that basically, yeah, and that takes very seriously in the interdependence of everyone, right? That kind of tries to embody the things you talk about, you know, in Trans Femme Futures. So I think regardless of what happens in the future, like I hope that that's one of the roles that the book plays, right? As a space to analyze like how radical queer, you know, queer and trans practices like envisioned futures. But I also think that, you know, imagining ourselves like in this commune, that yes, I think that I I don't believe in, so some of the narratives that I've seen come out in queer and trans spaces are around like, oh, queer people are sacred, or like trans people are sacred, we're sacred beings. I don't believe in that. I don't think there are sacred beings. Like I actually think we are all equally sacred, regardless of our relationship to transness. So there's a part of me that wants to answer that question of being like, oh, there, you know, because queer and trans practices lead the way, there's this like emphasis. But actually, I think that it's really a future in which those practices just become the practices of the world, right? Like that those just become the modalities of like relationality, such that they're no longer visible as a separate entity, necessarily. And that's, I know Michelle would have a lot to say if she was here. But it's also about projecting, like, you know, in the book, like gender is not fully, like everyone is vague, like gender is much less discernible in the book than it would be if it wasn't written into the future, right? So we're sort of moving towards this like radical horizon, but there it's not fully gone, and there are people who are like trans and people who are supposedly not, as we see in the Kyla Pwan chapter, which I think is something that Michelle and I had slightly different perspectives on. But I think the book is like, if we were to imagine another 100 years into that future, right, I would imagine that we'd be much closer to it, like a kind of a place where gender is primarily a place of play and expression, and where it exists, and it's situational for people as well, rather than a like stable identity, and that you wouldn't have that same, so it wouldn't, that centrality of like, yeah, queer and trans folks wouldn't look the same, right? It's like the centrality of the practice as opposed to the centrality of the identity. Yeah. Does that make sense? I was kind of making it up as I went along. Okay, great.
I've been thinking a lot about, I was writing about this a while back around the questions around like, if oral history is the mode of remembering, then especially trans bodies become the site of remembrance, and then that's like the locus of what those bodies have experienced, like what we've experienced, what we've been through, becomes part of the, you know, the formation through which memory can be developed. And like I was kind of in dialogue with Ros Keaveney, who's an old friend of mine. She's in her 70s. She was involved in the GLF and in the 70s here, and also in feminists against censorship in the 90s, all this kind of stuff. She's also a writer. And you know, she was just like, oh, it's sometimes just about the random cells in your brain that you get to access again. And was talking a lot about how drug abuse in the 80s had really like affected a lot of trans people, especially like next to HIV/AIDS. And in that is the sense of like, okay, so what kind of body work, memory work, trauma work are we going through, and do we go through, do we need to, does like, as part of like working through transness, living transness in the long term, entail that we're kind of invited to address, and then we often have to. And so I wonder if that's part of this, like, and that's not to say it's just about being transness, because it's also thinking about be that intergenerational memory around being like colonized, about colonization, about like in the present, and first, like as a, you know, as first gen, like, or as like people, in my case, like I'm Bengali, and like we're dealing with this, like we also have to deal with the silence around partition, and these, and that's like part of how the intergenerational divides are constructed, and you have to both, like there's like forms of respect around that, but also forms of questioning, and I know that I wonder if is something in the, like, the kinds of practices of memory and remembering through which we make sense of our existences and our histories and ourselves, maybe, and the things that we do, because none of those things are separated as well.
And the possibilities that we had or didn't have.
Right?
Like there's a certain empathy for yourself that you can have once you're able to contextualize your story and what was possible, and what wasn't.
Thank you both so much, Eman, Nat. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you everyone who joined us as well.
Thank you.
We will stop the webinar there, but we will be hopefully releasing a recording of it, so people can watch it back if they want to. But yeah, thank you both so much, and we will see you soon. Oh yeah,
can I
absolutely.
give a tiny shout out if people are in Edinburgh,
Of
which
course.
some of you are, or in Scotland?
You can't. Oh, someone's raising their hands.
Beautiful. Oh,
hello,
Alex, talking permitted.
Alex. They may have raised their hand by accident.
Okay, they put their hand down.
Oh no, sorry, Alex. Yeah, go ahead, Nat. You can't call it every single fringe show
happening around Edinburgh Art Festival. Both Friday, Haven are doing an event. Haven are a feminist artists collective from Beirut, and also on Sunday, for the closing conversation, there's a real focus on Palestine and Lebanon. Palestine Film Festival are screening some films, so please come. It'll be nice. Maybe see you there.
Brilliant, thank you. We will send links to both of those out in the email to everyone who came along with, there was a documentary you mentioned, Takeover, we'll send that out as well, along with links to the books so people can find you. All right.
There's also the website.
Oh, is the website up?
Not yet, but we're soliciting contributions. So if people want to write a story or give us $10 to give to someone who wrote a story,
be in the future for $10.
We're happy to do. But you'll be able to read the stories without paying anything, of course. But we're trying to pay artists.
They can think about how $10 will be worthless in the future once you've abolished money. That'll be fine.
Exactly.
We'll send those out. And yeah, thank you everybody, and thank you Nat and Eman.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for organizing. Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.